I never thought a marriage could end in silence this heavy. One hand took my pension, the other struck my face. That night felt like the end, until I realized it was the beginning. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. My name is Lorraine and I am 69 years old. For most of my life, I believed loyalty, patience, and quiet strength were enough to keep a marriage standing. I carried those beliefs carefully, like something fragile that could shatter if handled too roughly. I learned early on how to listen more than I spoke, how to bend instead of push back, how to convince myself that peace mattered more than being heard. I was a wife before I was anything else, and I wore that role with pride. We lived in a modest town in the Midwest, the kind of place where people smile politely and assume they know your life just by the condition of your front yard. From the outside, our marriage looked stable, ordinary, respectable. Inside the house, though, I had been slowly disappearing. Not all at once. Not in a way anyone would notice. I made myself smaller over time, choosing quiet over conflict, acceptance over questions. Felt easier that way. Safer. My husband and I had been married for more than 40 years. I trusted him completely, with our money, our plans, and my sense of security. When I retired, my pension became the backbone of our household. It was something I had earned through decades of steady work, showing up day after day even when my body ached and my energy ran low. I never thought of it as mine alone. In my mind, marriage meant sharing without counting, giving without suspicion. Retirement settled into a gentle routine at first. I woke up early, made coffee, sorted the mail, and handled the bills like I always had. I ran errands, kept the house running, and told myself this was the season everyone talks about. The slower years you're supposed to enjoy after a lifetime of responsibility. I tried to believe that I had finally reached a place where things could simply be calm. But slowly things began to shift. Questions about money were brushed aside. Bank statements seemed to vanish before I could review them. When I asked where something had gone, I was met with a soft smile and a familiar dismissal. I worried too much, he said. I was too old to stress over numbers. The words sounded gentle, almost caring, but they carried something else underneath. A quiet message that my voice no longer mattered. So I said nothing. I didn't want to believe that doubt had found its way into a marriage this old. The night everything broke didn't come with shouting or threats. Came quietly, the way storms sometimes do. I noticed a deposit missing from my account, something I couldn't explain or ignore. I approached him calmly, my voice steady, my hands folded the way they always were when I wanted to keep the peace. I asked a simple question, one I had every right to ask. His response stunned me more than the missing money ever could. The anger in his eyes wasn't sudden. It felt revealed, like something that had been waiting. Before I could process what was happening, his hand struck my face. Not hard enough to knock me down, but hard enough to change everything. Hard enough to make the room feel unfamiliar. Hard enough to reduce 4 decades of trust to a single moment of fear and humiliation. I stood there frozen, not because of the pain but because of the clarity. Something I had refused to see for years was suddenly undeniable. A line had been crossed and there was no pretending it hadn't happened. That night, sitting alone, the house felt smaller. Colder. I understood that I wasn't just afraid, I was awake. And for the first time in a very long time, one truth became clear. Silence had protected him. And it had cost me everything. I've spent much of my life being known as someone's wife, someone's partner, someone who kept everything moving quietly behind the scenes. Rarely did anyone ask who I was beyond that role. By 69, I suppose I had grown used to it. I lived in the same small Midwestern town where routines feel permanent and people assume that stability must mean happiness. After more than 4 decades of marriage, the idea of starting over didn't feel brave or freeing. It felt irresponsible. Unnecessary. Almost like a betrayal of the life I had already lived. Before everything began to unravel, I believed my place in the marriage was clearly defined. I was the steady one. The organizer. The person who remembered appointments, due dates, birthdays, and all the small details that kept a household functioning. When something needed planning, I took care of it. When tension surfaced, I softened it. I never thought of this as weakness. I saw it as contribution. As partnership. As love expressed through consistency. Emotionally, I was worn down but still hopeful. Retirement had taken away the structure that once anchored my days, yet I believed it would open space for something gentler. For rediscovering myself and reconnecting with the man I had built a life alongside. I trusted him because trust had always carried us through the difficult years. We had weathered job losses, health scares, and long periods when money was tight and patience had to stretch further than comfort allowed. I depended on him in ways I didn't fully recognize at the time. Not because I lacked ability but because the balance between us had shifted slowly. I let him speak in conversations I didn't want to push back against. I let him answer questions that belonged to both of us. Little by little, I stepped aside, telling myself that this was what harmony looked like after 40 years together. I never believed I was naive. I paid attention. I noticed changes in mood, longer silences, sharper tones. I simply chose to interpret them gently. I told myself that age brought irritability, that stress had a way of changing people. I made excuses because I believed love meant endurance, and endurance meant staying quiet when things felt uncomfortable. When it came to money, my trust ran deep. Once my pension became our primary income, it seemed natural to let him handle it. He spoke with confidence about finances, about numbers and decisions, and I mistook that confidence for care. I didn't question it because questioning felt like doubt, and doubt felt dangerous to a marriage I was determined to protect. Emotionally, I leaned heavily on our shared history. 40 years had to mean something. Memories built over decades had to guarantee loyalty. I believed there were boundaries that would never be crossed, no matter how strained things became. At that stage of my life, I couldn't imagine trust being replaced by control so quietly, so completely. Looking back now, I can see how much of myself I had handed over without realizing it. Not in one dramatic moment, but gradually. With every decision I deferred. Every concern I swallowed. Every time I chose peace over honesty. I wasn't weak. I was patient. And patience, I would come to understand, can either shield you, or slowly prepare you for a reckoning. At that point, I still believed it had been protecting me. My days before everything finally broke followed a rhythm I almost never questioned. I woke early, often before the sun had fully risen, out of habit more than need. I made my coffee the same way each morning, stood by the kitchen window and watched the quiet street slowly come alive. Cars passed, porch lights flicked off, neighbors stepped outside for their routines. There was comfort in that predictability. Inside the house, I tried to mirror it, keeping everything calm, orderly, and familiar. I took care of the small things that keep a home running. Groceries, cleaning, appointments, all the details people only notice when they're missing. I opened the mail, paid the utility bills, and filed paperwork neatly away. Even after retiring, I felt responsible for making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. That sense of responsibility gave me purpose. It reassured me that I still had a role, that I was still needed. My pension carried more of the household than I ever said out loud. It covered the basics and the surprises that come with everyday life. I never complained about it. I had earned those benefits through years of steady work, and contributing felt natural. I didn't expect thanks. I didn't track expenses for leverage. I believed respect didn't need to be requested. It was simply there. At first, the changes were quiet enough to dismiss. Bank statements stopped arriving in the mail. When I asked about them, I was told everything had moved online, that there was no reason for me to worry. I noticed transactions I didn't recognize, amounts that didn't quite make sense, but I talked myself out of concern. There had to be an explanation. When I mentioned it, the response was always the same: soft laughter, a gentle wave of the hand, a reminder that I should relax and not stress myself. Then came the comments. Small at first, easy to overlook if you weren't listening closely. I was told I was forgetful. That retirement had made me slow. Whenever I asked about money, my age was brought into it, as if time itself had taken away my right to understand my own finances. The words weren't shouted, but they were repeated often enough to sink in, quietly reshaping how I saw myself. Emotionally, I began to feel smaller in my own home. Not frightened yet, just unseen. Decisions happened without my input. Conversations ended before I felt heard. My concerns were brushed aside and labeled as unnecessary worry. Still, I convinced myself this was normal. That long marriages shift. That peace sometimes means letting things go unsaid. I supported him in ways that went far beyond money. I listened when he vented. I adjusted my needs to keep things calm. I avoided confrontation because I believed peace was fragile, and I didn't want to be the one who shattered it. I thought strength meant holding everything together quietly without complaint. Looking back now, the warning signs feel obvious. Control wrapped in concern. Dismissal framed as protection. A slow imbalance that I allowed because I believed trust mattered more than clarity. I didn't realize that every time I stayed silent, I was teaching him just how far he could push. At the time I still believed love would correct itself. That respect would return if I stayed patient. I hadn't yet learned that patience, when taken for granted, can quietly turn into permission. The moment everything changed didn't arrive with any warning. It came quietly, disguised as a question I had asked many times before without consequence. I was sitting at the kitchen table sorting through the mail, when a notice from the pension office caught my attention. The numbers didn't make sense. A deposit that should have been there wasn't. At first I assumed it was a simple mistake. Systems fail. Clerical errors happen. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I waited until he came home. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him of anything. I asked calmly if he knew why my pension account looked different. I remember keeping my hands folded, my tone measured, as though the way I spoke might determine how the conversation ended. For a brief moment he said nothing. Then his expression shifted into something I had never seen before. It wasn't confusion or concern. It was irritation, sharp and immediate. He told me I was imagining things. Said I didn't understand finances the way I used to. When I insisted, still calmly, that the money was mine and I had a right to know, his voice rose. The air in the room changed. Years of unspoken tension surfaced all at once. He accused me of questioning his authority, of being ungrateful, of creating problems where none existed. I tried to slow the conversation down. I reminded him that I wasn't attacking him, that I only wanted clarity. That was when he stepped closer. The movement was sudden enough to make me freeze. And then, without another word, he struck me. Not hard enough to leave a mark others could see, but hard enough to leave no confusion about what had just happened. The sound echoed louder in my head than it ever could have in the room. In that instant 40 years collapsed into a single, unbearable truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't stress or a momentary lapse. It was control exposed without apology. I stood there stunned, less from the pain than from what it meant. The house felt unnervingly quiet afterward. Everything looked ordinary, untouched, as if nothing had happened. He didn't apologize. He didn't look ashamed. He told me not to make a scene, not to exaggerate, not to tell anyone. As if silence was still something he had the right to demand from me. Someone else was in the house that evening, close enough to hear raised voices. No one intervened. No one asked if I was all right. Their silence felt like agreement, and that realization cut deeper than the slap itself. In that moment I understood how alone I truly was. When I finally sat down, my hands were shaking, not from fear but from disbelief. My pension was gone, taken without my consent. My dignity had been stripped away in my own kitchen. And the man I had trusted to protect me had chosen to hurt me instead. That night I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat quietly and let the truth settle in. Something fundamental had broken, and it couldn't be repaired by pretending it hadn't happened. With painful clarity I understood this was no longer just about money. It was about power. After that night the house no longer felt like a place I truly belonged. The walls were the same, the furniture untouched, but something invisible had shifted. I moved through each room quietly, careful not to draw attention to myself, like a guest who had stayed too long. Every sound felt sharper than it should have. Every silence carried weight. I slept lightly, waking at the smallest noise, my body tense even when nothing seemed wrong. The shame came first. Not because I believed I had done something wrong, but because humiliation settles in before reason has time to catch up. I replayed the moment over and over, asking myself how I had allowed things to reach that point. I told myself I should have noticed sooner, should have asked harder questions, should have protected myself better. Those thoughts circled endlessly, offering no answers, only fatigue. I avoided eye contact. I stopped asking questions. Our conversations became brief and cautious, limited to what was absolutely necessary. He behaved as though nothing had changed, as if the slap had never happened. That denial cut deeper than I expected. It told me he believed the moment could simply disappear if he refused to acknowledge it. And for a while I allowed that illusion to stand. Emotionally, I felt a kind of isolation I had never known. I had shared a life with this man for decades, yet suddenly I felt alone in the same space. Familiarity no longer brought comfort. Routine no longer offered reassurance. Even ordinary moments, sitting at the table folding laundry, watching television, felt strained, as though I were always bracing for something else to go wrong. The loss of my pension weighed heavily on me, But the loss of dignity was far more painful. That money represented years of work, years of contribution, years of believing I was helping build a secure future. To have it taken without my consent, and then to be silenced with violence when I asked about it, forced me to question everything I thought I understood about my place in this marriage. Inside, I was torn between two instincts. One urged me to endure, to stay quiet, to hold on to whatever stability remained. At my age, starting over felt frightening. I worried about where I would go, how I would manage, whether anyone would believe me. The other instinct, quieter but persistent, reminded me that silence had already taken more from me than it had ever protected. I began to watch him more closely. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed his confidence, the certainty with which he moved through the house, convinced that I would remain passive. That certainty unsettled me, but it also revealed something important. He believed I was powerless. He believed age had made me dependent, fragile, easy to control. There were moments when fear nearly overtook me. Moments when the idea of speaking up felt reckless, even dangerous. But beneath that fear, something steadier began to take shape. A growing understanding that surviving without dignity was not safety at all. I didn't make any sudden moves. I didn't confront him again. Outwardly, I remained calm, compliant, and quiet. Inside, though, the uncertainty was gone. The shock was fading, replaced by something firmer. I knew that whatever came next would require patience, clarity, and strength. And for the first time since that night, I felt something other than fear. I felt resolve. What he didn't know, what no one had ever bothered to ask, was that I had spent years handling the paperwork of our lives. Not because I wanted control, but because someone had to keep things in order. Long before retirement, I filed tax returns, sorted insurance forms, and organized records so nothing fell apart. Even after I stepped back, those habits never left me. They stayed quiet, waiting. And when I needed them most, they were there. In the days after the slap, memories surfaced that I had pushed aside. Passwords I had created and maintained. Accounts I had once checked regularly. Copies of documents I had saved without giving them much thought. At the time, those papers felt routine, almost forgettable. Now they felt like a lifeline. I didn't rush. I didn't act from anger or fear. I waited until the house was empty and sat at the same kitchen table where everything had unraveled. My hands were steady as I opened old folders and logged into accounts I hadn't checked in months. What I found confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Transfers I had never authorized. Changes made quietly, carefully. My pension hadn't vanished. It had been redirected. The proof was unmistakable. Bank statements with clear dates and amounts. Pension authorization forms bearing signatures I recognized, even though I knew I had never given consent. Emails confirming changes I had never requested. It was all there, laid out plainly, waiting for someone to look closely enough. And now I was looking. As I gathered everything, something unexpected settled in. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Clarity. For the first time since that night, I understood the full shape of what had been done to me. This wasn't confusion or poor judgment. It was a pattern. A series of deliberate choices. And deliberate choices leave trails. I made copies, digital and physical. I organized timelines, highlighted inconsistencies, and noted patterns that couldn't be explained away. I didn't confront him. I didn't hint at what I knew. Outwardly, I remained the quiet presence he had grown used to. I listened when he spoke. I nodded when he dismissed my concerns. I let him believe his control was intact. Inside, something had shifted. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. I began to reflect on the years that had led to this moment. The sacrifices I had made, the times I had adjusted, deferred, and endured. I realized my strength had never been loud, but it had always been steady. The patience I once used to keep the peace was now being repurposed. Not to protect him, but to protect myself. There was no thrill in what I was doing. No hunger for revenge. Just a calm understanding that I had options, and those options were grounded in facts, not emotion. Whatever came next wouldn't depend on raised voices or dramatic scenes. It would depend on the truth. I kept everything to myself. I didn't share my findings or look for validation. I continued gathering what I needed, piece by piece, letting time work in my favor. Silence, I had learned, could be dangerous, but it could also be strategic. And for the first time since the night my world cracked open, I felt prepared for what came next. There came a moment when the weight of what I knew grew heavier than the fear of what might happen if I acted. It didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly through quiet mornings and long restless nights, until the thought of doing nothing felt more dangerous than speaking up. I understood then that if I stayed silent, it would no longer be patience. It would be surrender. I didn't announce my decision to anyone. I didn't rehearse speeches or imagine dramatic confrontations. I simply reached a place where my thoughts felt settled. The confusion that had clouded my mind began to lift. The doubt softened. What remained was a clear understanding of my situation and a steady sense of direction. I wasn't driven by revenge. I was driven by the need for fairness. For balance. For an end to the control that had been quietly imposed on my life. My first step was careful and deliberate. I sought information, not reassurance. I made appointments under ordinary pretenses and asked questions without revealing the full story. I wanted to understand my legal standing before anyone knew what I was considering. I needed to know what options existed, what protections were available, and what consequences might follow. Not just for him but for me as well. Those conversations were grounding in ways I hadn't expected. Hearing facts laid out plainly without judgment or emotion steadied me. They confirmed what my instincts had already been telling me. What had been done wasn't just painful, it was wrong. And it was wrong in a way that could be addressed through proper channels, if I moved carefully and thoughtfully. I didn't feel anger during this phase. I felt focused. Each piece of information strengthened my resolve. I learned which documents mattered most, which timelines were critical, and how important it was to remain composed. I understood how easily emotion could cloud judgment, and I refused to let that happen now. At home, nothing appeared different. I kept to my routines. I spoke when spoken to. I made sure my behavior didn't reveal the shift taking place inside me. He continued to believe I was subdued, uncertain, still dependent. That belief worked to my advantage. It gave me space to think, to prepare, and to plan without interference. I also prepared myself emotionally. Standing up after years of silence is never easy, especially when age has been used against you. I reminded myself that experience is not weakness. That surviving decades of compromise had given me insight, not fragility. I had learned when to wait and when to act, and now I was choosing to act. This wasn't the moment of confrontation yet. It was quieter than that, but no less important. A line had been drawn, not on paper but within me. I was no longer questioning whether I deserved justice. I knew that I did. And once that certainty settled in, there was no turning back. The decision to move forward didn't come with drama. There was no sudden rush of courage or anger that pushed me into action. It was quieter than that, almost ordinary. I woke up one morning and understood without hesitation that I could not spend the rest of my life carrying someone else's wrongdoing in silence. That understanding settled into me gently, like a truth that no longer needed debate. It wasn't an emotion. It was a fact. I started with the smallest step that still carried weight. I gathered the documents I had already organized and went through them again, slowly and carefully, making sure I understood every detail. Dates, amounts, signatures. I wanted absolute certainty before I allowed anyone else to see them. This wasn't about proving a point or making a statement. It was about protecting myself and knowing exactly where I stood. I reached out for guidance in a way that wouldn't draw attention. I asked careful, measured questions, framed around process rather than accusation. I needed clarity, not reassurance. I wanted to understand what options were available, what steps could be taken, and what consequences might follow if I chose to move forward. Each answer grounded me further, adding another layer of confidence I hadn't felt in a long time. What surprised me most during this period was how calm I felt. The fear that had once kept me frozen no longer had the same hold on me. In its place was a steady awareness of my own capability. I realized I wasn't moving toward revenge. I was moving toward balance, toward fairness, toward a version of myself that no longer accepted harm as the price of peace. At home, nothing appeared different. On the surface, I stayed the same. My voice remained even. I didn't challenge him. I didn't mention money, documents, or questions. I let him believe that my silence meant submission. That assumption worked in my favor. It gave me space to think clearly, to prepare carefully, and to choose my timing without pressure. I also prepared myself for what this path might require emotionally. Standing up would bring disruption. It would bring discomfort. It might invite judgment from people who only saw the surface of our life together. I accepted that possibility. I reminded myself that dignity isn't preserved by avoiding conflict. It's preserved by refusing to live in fear. This step wasn't about exposing him yet. It wasn't about confrontation or consequence. It was about commitment. A quiet commitment to myself that I would no longer minimize what had been done to me. That I would no longer shrink to make someone else comfortable. That I would follow this path through even if it took time. By the end of that week, the direction was clear. I didn't feel victorious or relieved. I felt steady. And that steadiness told me I was ready for whatever came next. The confrontation didn't come from anger and it didn't come from impulse. By the time I spoke, I had already made peace with whatever the outcome might be. I waited for a moment when the house was quiet, when there were no distractions, no raised voices to hide behind. I wanted clarity, not chaos. I wanted the truth to stand on its own without noise around it. I asked him to sit with me at the kitchen table. The same table where I had once folded myself into silence. He looked surprised but not worried. There was still an ease in his posture, a confidence that told me he believed I was hesitant, unsure, dependent. That assumption sat plainly on his face, and for the first time, it didn't unsettle me at all. I didn't accuse him. I didn't mention the slap. I didn't revisit the pain or the humiliation. I simply placed the documents in front of him one at a time. Bank statements. Pension records. Authorization forms. I watched closely as his expression changed. The certainty he carried began to drain away, slowly, replaced first by confusion, then by calculation as he realized exactly what he was looking at. I spoke calmly. My voice didn't shake. I told him I knew where my pension had gone when it had been redirected and how it had been done without my consent. I explained that I had verified every detail, that nothing I was saying came from assumption or emotion. These were facts. They didn't need defending. They didn't need interpretation. At first he tried to interrupt me. He attempted to explain, to minimize, to redirect the conversation the way he always had. I didn't raise my voice to stop him. I simply waited until he finished, then continued exactly where I had left off. That quiet steadiness changed the air in the room. For the first time he wasn't guiding the conversation. He was responding to it. When I mentioned that I had sought advice and understood my options, his posture shifted. It was subtle but unmistakable. The authority he had relied on for years began to fracture. He started asking questions then, not from concern but from uncertainty. I answered only what was necessary. I didn't threaten. I didn't demand. I let the truth do the work for me. After I finished speaking, silence settled between us. It stretched longer than either of us expected. In that silence I could see the realization taking shape. Control had moved. Not through force. Not through fear. But through preparation, patience, and truth. I told him this wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. About restoring what had been taken and addressing what had been done. I made it clear that I would no longer participate in a life built on intimidation and secrecy. That version of our marriage was over. He looked at me differently then. Not with anger. Not with affection. But with the understanding that I was no longer someone he could dismiss or silence. The narrative he had controlled for decades had shifted and he knew it. In that moment I understood something completely. Speaking up hadn't made me weaker. It had simply revealed how strong I had been all along. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, the way truth often does when it's finally given space to exist. What I had documented could no longer be dismissed as confusion or brushed aside as a private marital issue. The misuse of my pension left a clear, undeniable trail, and once it moved through the proper channels, it carried a weight neither of us could control anymore. The financial reckoning came first. Accounts were reviewed carefully. Transfers were traced. Authorizations were examined line by line. What he had once shielded with confidence and intimidation was now reduced to dates, signatures, and timelines. The money taken without my consent was identified and followed, and the explanations he offered simply couldn't stand up to the facts. I learned then that control rarely survives scrutiny. As the process continued, his certainty began to unravel. He was no longer speaking with authority or dismissing concerns with ease. He was answering questions he hadn't prepared for, responding to inquiries he couldn't avoid, facing consequences he had assumed would never reach him. The confidence he once used to silence me lost its power completely, replaced by a nervous urgency that revealed how fragile it had always been. Socially, the shift was just as clear. People who had accepted his version of our life without question began to notice the inconsistencies. The story he relied on no longer matched the evidence being presented. I didn't need to justify myself or explain what had happened. I didn't need to convince anyone. The facts did that work for me. This time, silence wasn't a weapon used against me, it worked in my favor. What stayed with me most was how quickly the balance changed once the truth was no longer confined to our home. The authority he believed he held, over the money, over the narrative, over me, dissolved under examination. This wasn't punishment fueled by bitterness. It was accountability. And that distinction mattered more than anything. Throughout it all, I remained composed. I didn't take satisfaction in his discomfort, and I didn't seek sympathy from anyone watching the situation unfold. My focus stayed where it belonged, on restoring what had been taken and securing my own safety and independence. Each step forward reinforced something I had come to understand deeply. Justice doesn't need anger to be effective. It needs clarity, patience, and persistence. For years, I had been made to feel small, uncertain, easily dismissed. Watching that illusion collapse wasn't dramatic or triumphant. It was grounding. It reminded me that power built on intimidation cannot survive transparency. By the time the consequences fully settled, there was no confusion left about where control rested. It was no longer in his hands. It was in mine. Regaining what had been taken from me didn't come in a single triumphant moment. It happened quietly, almost gently, as my life began to realign around choices I was finally making for myself. The return of my pension mattered, of course, but what mattered more was the restoration of something deeper. My sense of safety. My dignity. My right to exist without fear in my own home. I began making changes that reflected that shift. Practical changes. Necessary ones. I stopped deferring decisions and waiting for permission to speak. I set boundaries where none had existed before and held them without explanation or apology. I learned that independence doesn't need to be loud to be real. It shows itself in calm, steady decisions made consistently, even when no one is watching. There were moments when I saw understanding settle into him. Not all at once, but slowly as reality replaced assumption. He began to grasp what he had lost, not only financially but relationally. Control had been his currency for years, and once it was gone, there was nothing left to bargain with. I didn't feel satisfaction in that realization. I accepted it as the natural outcome of his own choices. My focus shifted fully to rebuilding a life that felt honest and grounded. I returned to parts of myself I had neglected, interests I had set aside, routines that belonged to me alone. I took care of my health, my space, my future. Each small decision reinforced something I needed to remember. I was capable. I was resilient. And I was fully entitled to the life I was shaping. There was no dramatic reconciliation. No sudden apology that erased what had happened. And I didn't need one. Justice doesn't require remorse to be valid. It requires acknowledgement, accountability, and the freedom to move forward without fear. I had all three. What surprised me most was how peaceful that freedom felt. Not euphoric. Not overwhelming. Just steady. For the first time in years, I wasn't reshaping myself to accommodate someone else's power. I was standing in my own. I had been underestimated because of my age, my patience, my quiet nature. That underestimation allowed harm to happen, but it also allowed the truth to surface without resistance. I hadn't won by overpowering anyone. I had won by refusing to disappear. And that, I realized, was enough. Standing here now, I understand something I didn't fully grasp before. Strength doesn't always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like endurance, like careful observation, like waiting until the truth is steady enough to stand on its own. For a long time, I believed that staying quiet was how I kept my life intact. I see now that silence only serves you when it protects you, not when it shields someone else's harm. At my age, people often expect acceptance. They expect you to be grateful for whatever remains and to stop asking questions. They mistake experience for weakness, patience for permission. I allowed that misunderstanding to shape my life longer than it should have. Not because I didn't know better, but because I wanted to believe loyalty would be met with loyalty in return. This experience taught me that dignity isn't lost in a single moment. It erodes slowly, through small compromises and repeated dismissals that feel insignificant at the time. And it's reclaimed the same way, through deliberate choices, measured steps, and the refusal to dismiss what you know deep down is wrong. I don't tell this story to invite sympathy. I tell it because there are others who will recognize themselves in these moments. People who have been taught to endure instead of question, to adapt instead of speak. Especially women who have spent decades being dependable, unseen, and underestimated. Age does not erase your rights. If anything, it sharpens your understanding of them. I didn't walk away from this stronger because I recovered what was taken. I walked away stronger because I stopped accepting a version of life that required me to shrink. Justice didn't arrive as a dramatic finale. It arrived as clarity, as safety, as the freedom to move forward without fear. If there is one truth I carry with me now, it is this. Patience is a virtue, but it is not an obligation. And silence only has power when it is chosen, not when it is imposed. I reclaimed my voice not by raising it but by trusting it. And once that trust returned, everything changed. If this story touched you, please subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Your voice matters here. Until next time, choose dignity always.